Okay, The Great Gatsby, Chapter 8, begins with Nick acknowledging that he could not sleep at all that night. He hears a foghorn groaning incessantly out on the water. He's having terrible dreams, waking up, falling back asleep, terrible dreams again and again. And then he hears a taxi cab pull into Gatsby's driveway just before dawn. And he says he feels he had something to tell Gatsby, something to warn him about, and the morning would be too late. So the author here, Fitzgerald, establishes a very ominous mood. It's very death feeling overall with the foghorn and the terrible dreams, and then he needs to tell him something. So Nick literally gets up at 4 a.m. and goes over to Gatsby's house. And Gatsby tells Nick that he had waited outside of Daisy's window until 4 o'clock in the morning when she came to the window and stood there for a minute and then turned out the light. So he was sort of sitting a vigil, waiting for her, hoping that, she would be okay, or maybe that she would come out to him. And of course, she didn't do that. So the two of them go through Gatsby's house. And this is also described in a very ominous way. They're pushing aside curtains that are so big they feel like pavilions. It's dark. They have a hard time finding the light switches. They stumble over things as they're walking. There's a reference to a ghostly piano and an inexplicable amount of dust everywhere. And the rooms were musty as though they hadn't been aired out for many days. This reminds me of the Valley of Ashes and death, just, completely a wasteland. His house has no glorious anything anymore since Daisy is no longer his. Nick tells Gatsby he thinks that he should go away. He's pretty sure that they'll figure out it was his car and that he's going to get in trouble, probably get arrested. And Gatsby says, "Go away now?" Like, he can't imagine leaving. He still thinks it's possible that Daisy might come to him, which is very naive. I made a note about that. Then there's a flashback again. And it's here that Nick says that Gatsby originally told him about his past with Dan Cody. And remember, we read about Dan Cody in chapter 6. And then he also goes on and talks about the first time that he met Daisy. So we also heard earlier in the story Jordan's account of the first time Gatsby and Daisy met. This is going to be Gatsby's account of how he met Daisy and what he thought about her. He was at Fort Camp Taylor. He went to her house at first with other officers from the military base. He says he had never been in such a beautiful house before, and he was so amazed at how casual she was in this beautiful house, that she was as casual in her beautiful house as he was in his tent. And so it just showed him that she was genuinely a rich girl. Like, she didn't think anything of it. He says that her home was a place where there were gay and radiant activities taking place all the time, romances that were not musty and laid away already in lavender, which is, of course, what his house is like now, but fresh and breathing and redolent of this year's shiny motor cars and of dances whose flowers were scarcely withered. He's also excited by Daisy because he recognizes that other men had already loved her, which increases her value in his eyes. So remember that during this time period, women were seen as possessions. They were seen as an accessory, and that, they were meant to make a man look good. And so the fact that other men loved her meant that, she was an especially appealing woman who would make him look especially good. He also knows that he has no business in her house, that he's there by accident, that he's really a penniless young man without a past. Of course, he has a past. He has just rejected it because he doesn't want to be acknowledged as somebody who came from a farm in North Dakota. So Nick says that he took what he could get ravenously and unscrupulously, even took a Daisy one still October night, took her because he had no real right to touch her hand. So this implies that there was a sexual relationship. He also says that he had given Daisy the impression that he could take care of her, that they were of the same sort of class, which of course is not the case, because Gatsby does not have a comfortable family and he doesn't come from anything close to her lifestyle. So Nick says here, this is his own assumption, that Gatsby probably took what he could and was going to just, take advantage of the fact that she was willing, and then he was going to leave. But he finds out that he actually has committed himself to the following of a grail. So this is an allusion to King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table, where they are pursuing the Holy Grail. He's comparing Daisy to a Holy Grail. He didn't realize just how extraordinary a nice girl could be. And I thought this was a really interesting quote. He felt married to her, that was all. So that seems like a contradiction. Like, to be married is a pretty significant commitment. Obviously you can use the word marry, like to sort of be committed in a general way, or to be, like you can be married to an idea in the sense that you are really committed to an idea. But obviously you can also be married to a person. But this kind of a line here indicates that in Gatsby's eyes, she's more than just a person to marry, that there's something else that she has that he's hoping to get from her. So Gatsby soon is breathless, who was somehow betrayed. Her porch was bright with the bought luxury of starshine, the wicker of the settee squeaking fashionably. Gatsby was overwhelmingly aware of the youth and the mystery that wealth imprisons and preserves, of the freshness of many clothes, and of Daisy gleaming like silver, safe and proud above the hot struggles of the poor. This is a pretty famous quote. This reference to the freshness of many clothes reminds me of all the special clothes that Gatsby had custom made and sent from England that Daisy cried over when he threw all his lovely shirts on the bed. So these are some of the trappings of wealth that he has been pursuing. He's trying to avoid the hot struggles of the poor that he's so familiar with from his past. Gatsby acknowledges that Daisy was impressed by Gatsby because she knew things that were different than the things that she knew. Like, Gatsby was aware about, he had done manual labor. He had traveled around the world with Dan Cody. So he'd had experiences that were impressive to her, and that, he could sort of share with her. So this next paragraph talks about that they were together for a month. That could be a quiz question. They had a month of love before he was going to be sent abroad. And then he did go off to war. He was a captain. That also might be a quiz question. And after the armistice, he tried to quickly come home because he wants to marry Daisy. But some complication or misunderstanding sent him to Oxford instead. So this is our full explanation of how Gatsby got to Oxford University. He wasn't supposed to go there. He had no intention of going, but somehow he ended up there. So I think that actual description that the soldiers were given the opportunity to go to a college is true. He just had no intention of pursuing that, which is how he only stayed for 5 months. He's worried because he wants to make sure he gets back to Daisy before she decides to move on, which is, of course, what she's going to end up doing, because Daisy feels the pressure of the world outside. And, there's parties that she's being invited to, and we have a description here of, the sad music, but there's also this lovely, beautiful lifestyle that she's living as she goes to these parties. And we have another reference to jazz music. So this juxtaposition of sadness with beauty is something that is associated with Daisy through the entire novel. She's desperate for a decision. She starts to date men again. She feels that a decision must be made by some force, that she has to just decide either to wait for Gatsby or to marry somebody else. And that force is Tom Buchanan. So when Tom Buchanan arrives in Louisville, she sees him as wholesome, and bulky. Excuse me. And obviously he's very wealthy, and he has the right kind of money, and Daisy is flattered that he's interested in her. And so then we have a reference here. The letter reached Gatsby while he was still at Oxford. So this letter, we have to infer, is Daisy writing to Gatsby to tell him that she's going to marry Tom. Their romance is officially over. So now it's morning. The sun has come up. There's another reference here to shadows, to ghostly birds, to blue leaves. All of this, again, is very sort of death-like. And it's a cool day. So it's not the summertime feeling anymore. And we're going to find out here in this paragraph, we're sort of going to be heading into autumn. And Gatsby just bursts out and says, I don't think she ever loved him. And actually, that's probably a fair statement. You know, it's quite possible she never did. I mean, think about the night before she got married, how she was drunk because she'd read Gatsby's letter, and she had thrown away the pearls and said she wasn't going to marry him. So I think we can definitely assume that she maybe never did love him or didn't love him enough. So then he acknowledges, Gatsby does, well, maybe she loved him for a minute, but then loved me even more. Don't you see? Which, of course, not really. I think Fitzgerald does a wonderful job of showing how confused Gatsby is and how his thought processes really don't make any logical sense. And then Gatsby says, in any case, it was just personal. So this is often not a quote test. It's an unusual thing to say, just like he felt married to her, that's all. And Nick explains this, saying that there was some intensity in his conception of the affair that couldn't be measured. His feeling about Daisy is way bigger than personal, which is why I think we have this explanation here. So Gatsby came back from the war when Tom and Daisy were on their honeymoon, and he does this really interesting thing. He gets on a train and he goes to Louisville by himself. In this next couple of pages describe his trip there. He stays for a week. That could be a quiz question. He walks all the streets where he had walked with Daisy, and he just remembers her and what it was like to be with her. And then he left feeling that if he had searched harder, he might have found her. He keeps wishing that, she would still be there. He's trying to repeat the past. But obviously she's gone. He has no money. It was hot on that day that he went to Louisville to visit. And so he finally gets back on the train and leaves because he has no choice, because he has no money. He can't stay there any longer. And he sits outside between the train cars on a little vestibule because the air is fresher. And as he pulls away from Louisville, he reaches out his hand again and sort of stretches it out towards Louisville and where she had been. And this image here reminds me of how Gatsby was reaching his hand out early in the book as he looked at the green light across the bay. And that's the reference here, that he's reaching his hand out to where she had been. And it was all going by too fast now for his blurred eyes, and he knew that he had lost that best part of it, the freshest and best forever. So there was a moment where he recognized that he had lost her. And clearly his quest for money is also his quest to get rid of this feeling. He doesn't want to feel like that anymore. And he was really close. He was close to getting her, but it didn't work. So then the servants say they're going to drain the pool. And Gatsby says, no, I'd like to swim because I haven't been in the water all summer. He says, I've never used that pool all summer. And Nick needs to get to work, but he's hesitant to leave. He says, I didn't want to go to the city. I didn't want to leave him. I missed that train and then another before I could get myself away. So my note here is that Nick has a premonition that something's going to happen. He doesn't want to leave him alone. So Nick says he'll call Gatsby. He'll check on him. He says he'll call about noon. And Gatsby's hopefully saying, I think Daisy might call too, which of course doesn't happen. But Nick is nice and says, yes, maybe, I suppose so. And then before he actually leaves to get on the train, he says something really nice to Gatsby. He says, "They're a rotten crowd," I shouted across the lawn. "You're worth the whole damn bunch put together." And he says, "I've always been glad I said that. It was the only compliment I ever gave him because I disapproved of him from beginning to end." First he nodded politely, but then his face broke into that radiant and understanding smile, as if we'd been in ecstatic cahoots on that fact all the time. So there's this reference to the contradictory feelings Nick has, but that ultimately he really does like him, despite all those flaws. And he waves goodbye. Gatsby's still hanging on to the dream. And then when Nick gets to work, he falls asleep at his desk because, of course, he didn't sleep all night. And right before noon, the phone wakes him up and he gets nervous. And he's like, "Oh, my gosh, I need to call Gatsby." But before he does that, he gets this phone call that he has to answer, and it's from Jordan. And Jordan says that she has left Daisy's house, that she's at Hempstead, and she's going to Southampton this afternoon. So she's on Long Island. And she says that she was upset that Nick wasn't very nice to her the night before. And this is referring to the fact that Nick didn't want to come in for dinner when they got to the Buchanan's house. And even though she's angry, though, she still wants to see him. And Nick says that he wants to see Jordan too. But then they couldn't really figure out a way to get together because Nick is at work and Jordan's supposed to go out to Southampton. And Nick says they talked about this for a while, and then abruptly, "We weren't talking any longer and I didn't care." So they hang up kind of at odds. And then he tries to call Gatsby because he had said he'd call at noon, and he can't get through. There's a reference that the line was busy. They were keeping it open for a call from Detroit. So this is another reference to organized crime. And Nick draws a circle around the 3:50 train. This is the one he intends to get to go back to West Egg. He references what it had been like coming in to New York that morning because they went right through the Valley of Ashes. And he says that when he passed the ash heaps, he crossed to the other side of the car because he didn't want to look out and see Wilson's garage where the accident had happened. And now we have another flashback. Nick says he wants to go back and tell us what happened at the garage after they left the night before. And the natural question I have is, well, how does Nick know? Because he wasn't there. He left, and this is what happened after he left. So it's a legitimate question to wonder how Nick knows all this. We will get an answer to this later. Catherine had been called. Catherine was Myrtle's sister. And interestingly, she shows up at the garage completely drunk. So remember, at the beginning of the book, she said she never drinks. Apparently, she sometimes does. She was drunk, but she still does manage to get there. And Michaelis stays with George Wilson, even, all the way through the night, and some other strangers stay as well. And then it says here, around 3 a.m, Wilson's incoherent muttering changed. He grew quieter and began to talk about the yellow car. He announced that he had a way of finding out who the yellow car belonged to. And then he blurted out that a couple of months ago, his wife had come home from the city with her face bruised and her nose swollen. So this is showing us that George Wilson was able to figure out that Myrtle was leading a double life because she came home from that fight that they had when Tom broke her nose. So he remembers that. Michaelis keeps trying to talk to George about, don't you have any family or any friends? Do you have a church? Something where you could go? Because Michaelis feels the burden of trying to take care of him. He says, don't you have a church? Didn't you get married in a church? And all George can think about is what he had discovered about Myrtle. And then he says, with the same half-knowing look in his eyes, that God sees everything. And he's looking out the window at the billboard of Dr. T.J. Eckelberg. And Michaela says, that's an advertisement. That's not God. But remember, Dr. T.J. Eckelberg is a symbol for a witness or for God. So he, Mr. Wilson sees that, even though he didn't know Myrtle was having an affair, that God knew it. And so he tried to confront Myrtle and point out that somebody's always watching. You can't, everything you've been doing, you may fool me, but you can't fool God, is what he tells to his wife. And Michaelis tells him, well, that's just an advertisement, but the point is true. Myrtle was doing something wrong, and somebody knows it. So by 6 a.m, Michaelis is exhausted, clearly. And someone comes by the house, or by the garage finally, a stranger who'd been there from the night before. And Michaelis makes breakfast for the three of them. And then Michaelis goes home to get some sleep. And the other stranger who'd shown up stays with George Wilson for a little bit. And then when Michaelis wakes up 4 hours later, Wilson has gone. So this chronicles all the places that Wilson went on foot. He was walking all the way to West Egg. And it talks about that he stopped at a couple places for coffee. He bought a sandwich. Various people had seen him. He had told Michaelis he had a way of finding out who was driving that car. And it says here by 2:30, he was in West Egg, where he asked someone the way to Gatsby's house. So by that time, he knew Gatsby's name. So the question is, how did he find out Gatsby's name? We don't know that either. So back at Gatsby's house at 2:00, Gatsby's put on his bathing suit and left word with the butler that if anyone phoned, word was to be brought to him at the pool. He's still hoping Daisy's going to call. He goes into the garage and he gets an inflatable mattress, and he gets it all pumped up, and then he goes out to the pool. This is an important paragraph. No telephone message arrived, but the butler went without his sleep and waited for it until 4:00. So the butler stayed awake, not hoping, but to answer the phone if Daisy called, until long after there was anyone to give it to if it came. So this is our hint that Gatsby is dead. It describes here what Nick imagines Gatsby must have been thinking about as he laid in the pool looking up at the leaves. It says he must have felt that he had lost the old warm world, paid a high price for living too long with a single dream. He must have looked up at an unfamiliar sky through frightening leaves and shivered as he found what a gorgeous thing a rose is, and how raw the sunlight was upon the scarcely created grass. A new world, material without being real, where poor ghosts, breathing dreams like air, drifted fortuitously about, like that ashen, fantastic figure gliding toward him through the amorphous trees. So this is somebody coming for Gatsby. The chauffeur heard the shots. So there was a gunshot, more than one. Remember that Nick was going to get the 3:50 train. So it says, I drove from the station directly to Gatsby's house, and my rushing anxiously up the front steps was the first thing that alarmed anyone. But they knew then, I firmly believe. So Nick is saying that Gatsby was shot sometime after 2, and he suspects the staff knew it but didn't do anything about it. And when Nick gets there, they go out together. The chauffeur, the butler, the gardener, and Nick hurry down to the pool, and it describes the movement of the air mattress with the body on it, and that there was a little bit of blood circling in the water, and they carry Gatsby to the house. It says, after we started with Gatsby toward the house, the gardener saw Wilson's body a little way off in the grass, and the Holocaust was complete. So the 2 shots, one was at Gatsby, and one was Wilson shooting himself. And that is the end of chapter 8.